From the Columbia University Language Resource Center, this is Said and Done, the podcast about languages and the people who speak them. This is Said and Done. I'm Chris Kaiser, and joining me today is Simon Zuberek, educational technologist in the Language Resource Center. In Simon's third appearance on Said and Done, we talk about the rise in interest in artificial intelligence, specifically as it relates to language teaching and learning. We talk about how text-based generative AI works in general and how it differs from human intelligence. We discuss some ways in which large language model chatbots such as ChatGPT and Google Bard might not be helpful for language learners, and also some ways in which they could be useful in language learning. Here's my conversation with Simon Zuberek. Simon Zuberek, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate you coming back to Said and Done. This is the third time that you've appeared on this podcast, and I'm very grateful that you are here today to talk about AI and language learning. This is a topic that's very much on people's minds. And I should also mention that you are, I think, the most qualified person here at the Language Resource Center to talk about this. You're our educational technologist, and you're very much on the forefront of these developments. So thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Chris, for having me over yet again, which qualifies me to the podcast elite club, I guess. And yeah, it's great to be here. Let's get into it.
Yeah, so jumping right in, um, a lot of people over the last 9, 10, 11, 12 months have been talking quite with great interest and some concern about artificial intelligence and the rise of ChatGPT as a topic of everyday conversation. People are concerned about what it might mean for learning at all levels, including at the university level, and what it might mean for language learning specifically. That's what we're concerned about here. And so I wanted to just start off by asking you, in your opinion, is this really just this lightning bolt out of the blue and we didn't see it coming, or did you see it coming? How are you thinking generally about the rise of AI, maybe not so much as a actual technological phenomenon, but as a discourse, a topic that people are concerned about and thinking about and writing about?
So the way that I'm seeing it is maybe slightly different from how a lot of our colleagues seem to perceive it. To me, it is not as much of a watershed moment where things kind of changed overnight and we'll never be the same again, but kind of as a next step in a on a trajectory, some sort of a progression. um, it reminds me a lot of a moment that we all experienced back in 2016, I think it was, when machine translation became literally overnight really, really good. And that was as a result of an update, which I'm not going to be getting into technical details of, that Google performed literally overnight on certain languages and in their Google Translate platform, and it kind of just started working miraculously. Um, and much like now, back then, there was a lot of talk about that moment. There was a lot of discussion about what it means for education, what it means for foreign languages, what it means for translators, what it means for business. And what we're seeing right now, I think, is sort of a next step in that in that direction, where whereas what happened in 2016 sort of addressed the vocabulary, sort of the lexical layer of the language. Right now, what we're saying is a technology taking care of more of a morphosyntactic and grammatical, if you will, mechanics of a language. So, sort of the formal layer of it. But to back to your original question, I really don't think that this is something that we haven't seen coming. I don't think that this is a singular moment. I think it's just, natural next step in that progression, which some of our colleagues, bring all the way back to the calculator, right? Which could be successfully, I think, argued that is also a representation of very narrow, artificial intelligence.
Yeah, so for you, and I think for some of our other colleagues as well, I I think that you're seeing it more as a kind of evolution rather than revolution.
Hmm.
And so, if you're looking back to 2016 with the big upgrade that Google Translate got then, what were some of the concerns? And then how did some of those concerns actually play out in practice?
Yeah, so I think the concern was that instead of sort of, learning certain lexical items, certain expressions, chunks, phrases. And I'm speaking strictly in terms of, the foreign language classroom. Students will no longer be doing that, and instead they're just going to be resorting to, machine translation indiscriminately, which will then in turn, result in students not really being proficient or not really reaching the levels of proficiency that we as educators hope for them to reach at a certain level, and hitting these benchmarks. Um, after a couple of years, we have seen that that is not what has happened, and it is largely due to the fact that for all they're worth, for what it was worth, the machine translation technology um, kind of, in many ways, works like a dictionary, in a sense that in order to use it effectively and successfully, you have to know the language in the first place. So,
Mm.
you can have, of course, you can, as a user, you can input a sentence in your first language or the dominant language, ask it to translate to the target language. But you still, as a user, like you need to be able to ascertain whether the translation is correct, which then becomes even more difficult if you're working with individual words. Whether idiomatically it makes sense, whether it programmatically holds water. So yeah, sure, sort of the basic need of going from A to B is perhaps addressed, but that in turn kind of breeds even more questions and more problems, and more sort of or sheds light at even more areas of foreign language that maybe without machine translation we wouldn't even be as aware of.
I agree. And it seems to me that when we think back to 2016 and this great degree of concern over Google Translate, what you said is true, that, okay, I'm learning Spanish or I'm learning Zulu or I'm learning Chinese. Okay, I write if I'm doing a composition, which is sort of a classic exercise that maybe we don't really need to do anymore, but a lot of people still do it. I'm writing a composition in Spanish, and then I say, okay, I write it in English and then translate to Spanish. I don't really know what it says because I'm not at the level yet to know all of what it's saying.
Mhm.
So it's not super helpful as
Right.
a learning tool. I mean, it's good as a dictionary, a fast dictionary maybe, but it doesn't. You know, Google Translate doesn't really help you all that much with doing higher level stuff in a language that you're trying to learn. And so,
Mhm.
do you see a parallel with ChatGPT and text-based generative AI?
Yeah, so there are a lot of parallels, and that is simply because we are fundamentally dealing with very similar technologies. I mean, we are dealing with statistically derived mathematical models for language that sort of formalize the mechanics behind the language, right? So it is a representation of formal knowledge of a language, which machines have mastered simply due to the sheer amount of data that they have been fed. What they are still lacking, and what is a lot more nuanced and a lot more interesting, in my opinion, is the um, the functional knowledge of the language,
Mm,
which relies on different approaches cognitively on different processes, and this is something that we know from neurolinguistics. And it is a lot more difficult to sort of formalize in
mm,
terms of equations or probabilities, right? And this goes back to what you just said, that like I can have machines generate an essay or a composition that sounds authentic-ish, logical, rational. If I know the language, I can sort of I can ascertain whether it is also pragmatically or stylistically, idiomatically correct. If I don't, it may be problematic to do that. But fundamentally, the way that this composition has been created is not based on thinking the way that we are used to thinking as humans.
so,
I don't know if
I
that
mean,
answers the question.
yeah, well, it actually makes me want to ask another question, which
Okay.
is, so how does it, in a very basic way, how does um, an application like ChatGPT work, and how is this um, way of functioning different from the way that a human produces linguistic output in a
Right.
very, very basic way?
Sure. So, as humans, some people would argue that we are born with an innate knowledge of how language should function, right? This goes back to, of course, Chomsky and the idea of the universal grammar, which is innate to us. And then as we are exposed to our first language, this sort of changes, and or the representation, that model, that universal grammar changes. It tweaks up, it gets tweaked up a bit. And eventually it develops and forms into the our L1, right? Our mother language. Um, we do not, as humans, require a ton of data for that.
Mm,
Just a few years during the formative period seems to be sufficient to sort of build this representation, and for it to be good enough to serve us throughout our lifetime of generating language. In many ways, what machines do is the exact opposite. They start with the data without any sort of innate representation of a language. And they, from that data, then they build that representation, right? Um, in order for them to do that, they need multiple lifetimes of linguistic data that we are exposed to. So here you already see the difference, right? For us it's
mm,
more generative, for machines it's all repetitive. There is nothing really novel in what you see these models generate. um, so I would say that is one of the biggest differences, and of course that has ramifications. The more data you are able to feed these models, the more accurate they become, the more complex they become. um, and the better they can fool you. Conversely, if you're dealing with languages that are that are not as resourced, like any of the less commonly taught languages, or even languages that are spoken by millions of people, like Polish or Italian, for instance, you will see that the language that's generated by models developed on the is just not as good, right? It doesn't
mm,
sound
mhm.
as authentic. um,
If I can just interrupt you for a second, just to check my own understanding. So with a human, the linguistic input that a human receives as they're developing is, their family talking to them or their social context. And, that's nothing on the scale of like inputting all of Wikipedia, all of the internet, all of the books that have been written in a certain language, just gigantic volumes of data. No human would ever be able to assimilate all of that data in one, let alone 100 lifetimes. So it's just a different way of functioning then.
hmm Yeah.
Yeah.
The end result is, or I should say, could be eerily similar, but the underlying mechanics of arriving at the output is just fundamentally different.
So
Yeah.
that makes me kind of wonder, would we get to the point where a student of language, somebody who's studying a language, would they ever be able to rely entirely on an AI, or will they always need a human teacher to help them?
Um, it really, I think that depending on your level of proficiency, you may be able to come to the point where another human being may not be necessary for you, simply because like you're proficient enough to operate within the language, right? Um, you are a very proficient speaker of Italian. I don't think that you would need a another human being for you to sort of tell you whether the content that's generated for you by a model is authentic enough or is correct enough. Like that is something that you can assess yourself. For learners who are not as proficient, it becomes very tricky. It becomes very tricky simply because these massive language models um, do not have any rails that sort of allow you to, or allow them to be able to tell you whether, how accurate they are.
Mm,
Um, it's kind of just like, okay, well, this is what I've seen on the internet, and this is, what I probabilistically, statistically, believe that should like this is how the text should look. And in order to answer your query, and this is what I'm giving you. But whether what I'm giving you is, what are you looking for, whether it's accurate,
yeah, so
headache, tough.
it seems like it would not be. I guess one concern is if you're learning a language, maybe you're in the elementary level or the intermediate level of a language at a university, you're trying to get, for example, ChatGPT to interact with you in Spanish or to write
Mhm,
something for you in Spanish or explain, a grammar point about Spanish grammar. You're not 100% sure that it's that it's true or that it's giving you the right thing. It could
mhm.
be making it up and it could be totally wrong.
Yeah, and whether it's correct or full of it, it provides the answer or provides the output with the same degree of authority, and it's
Yeah.
just impossible to to be able to discern that. Of course, it is on you then as a learner to be able to sort of spot mistakes and correct these errors, and always which always puts you on in the position where you have to question it, right? Which on the one hand is of course detrimental because it creates these situations where you're prone to replicating the mistakes that the model has made. But on the other hand, you are vigilant. You learn to question, you learn to be discerning. And then fundamentally, you also like once you spot a mistake, then you are able to figure out, okay, like this is what doesn't work here. Like this is why this isn't correct, and this is how maybe I should correct it or rephrase it.
So, yeah, it seems to me then that if you're sort of in the earlier levels of learning a language, your first or second year maybe, um, that ChatGPT, the big concern is it leading me astray? Is it telling me incorrect information? Or is it telling me information I can't ascertain whether it's correct or incorrect? But what
Mhm.
about sort of the higher levels? Let's say you've taken French for 5 years in high school and you're taking a super advanced French composition class or French literature class. What are in your view, what are some of the limitations of an application like ChatGPT when it comes to maybe the higher proficiency levels of language learning?
Um, like when we were talking about higher proficiency levels like that, we are no longer just talking about the lexical layer. We're no longer just talking about the morphosyntax. We are talking about pragmatics. We're talking about style. We're talking about genres. We are talking about pragmatics there. Those are the kind of things that are very difficult to. They're they're very difficult to formalize. They're kind of nebulous, right? So it's hard to write rules for them. It's hard to develop algorithms for them. The way that large models are trained doesn't make them always most sensitive to these nuances, and that is largely because these nuances are largely rare and they're very sparsely distributed, right? So um, if we are talking about, let's say, as a like analyzing text that needs to be in a specific genre, or if we are talking about specific pragmatic conventions that are used in or I don't know, like movie dialogue or something. Um, it may be problematic. It may be problematic for these models to detect them. It may be problematic for these models to use them correctly. Of course, the counterexample to these statements will be, but of course they can do it in English. Well, sure, yes, they can do it in English because over half of the internet is in English, right? So it's massive amounts of data. Again, doing it in Polish, not very well. Italian, I don't know. Don't have the expertise there. Um, as we generate more data as humans, chances are that these models will become better at these things. But at the same time, the way that many of these large models are trained is through what's called bootstrapping. So you essentially use the data that they themselves generated to train them, which is not always very good and oftentimes makes them less accurate and less potent. So, yeah, so, going back to the original question as a advanced student, I think you have to be even more vigilant, but in a different sense, in a way that is not necessarily, um, you know, like in a way that I don't know, it's not easy to learn or to derive from books, or like you may need to rely more on humans here than machines.
Yeah, so what you said made me think that if you're a more advanced student, then you if a lot of the data is in English, when I read ChatGPT, for example, in Italian, what I'm seeing is something that was written in English and then translated into Italian. It doesn't appear to me that much of the source material that goes into Italian ChatGPT is actually written in Italian. It seems to be written in English and then translated. So, as you're
Mhm,
saying, some of the culturally relevant nuance, some of the ways that people actually communicate in that language at a higher level, are just absent, at least at the moment, from these large language models.
mhm,
I I think that um, another issue is that really using language is in many instances an embodied experience, a culturally embodied experience. And so just reading text that's generated, it's sort of devoid of reference, and that becomes even more acute when you talk about this bootstrapping phenomenon where language that's AI generated then gets fed back into the AI,
yeah.
and you end up with kind of very mushy language that doesn't really sound like what people would normally say in reality. So I think that this just points to the fact that AI is giving all the more reason why you need to study language and study it in a certain way with another person. It can help you, and but it's not going to
Mm,
really help you all that much. But I think that it can help you. And I want to sort of close, or the final chapter of our conversation on the ways that right now you and I feel that it can help you.
mhm,
And I want to start off with a little anecdote, um, if I may, about how I used ChatGPT recently. So I have always wanted to understand the issue of what's called the longitude problem. I always knew that it had something to do with you need a clock, but I couldn't understand why you would need a clock to figure out your longitude. I asked ChatGPT, "Can you help me understand the longitude problem?" And so it explained it. It said, you need a clock, highly accurate clock that is synced with the time in, for example, in Greenwich, England. And then as you move across the globe, you look at your clock and then you find out what time the sun is at the highest point in the sky according to that clock, and then take that time differential and multiply that by 15, and that will tell you the degrees of longitude. And then I asked ChatGPT to give me a quiz based on this, um, where I could calculate the longitude of different measurements, and it did that. And so finally, after years, I really understood the longitude problem. So what I'm thinking is, ChatGPT can be great for figuring out something and being like an active learner, but it doesn't really help you too much if you don't really have a lot of questions to ask it. So I was just wondering, in your view, what is maybe one or two ways that ChatGPT could be helpful to a language learner?
So yeah, when we were talking about these generative models, much like in your case, in case of your experience, they could be very helpful with explaining various things, or generating clarifications, generating examples to illustrate certain grammatical points. I'm sure that many of our listeners are aware of the inductive approach to grammar instruction, where you sort of give your students a scaffolded sequence of sentences that illustrate a certain point. Let's say it is past preterite, and have them on their own, based on these scaffolded sentences, derive rules behind that govern the use of the preterite, right? So of course, in the classroom, they all do it, they discuss, then we kind of reconvene, they articulate it, then we juxtapose it against the official rules, quote unquote. All that can be actually done pretty successfully by the robots. These generative models have been fed enough of data and enough of instances of these explanations to connect the proverbial dots, and to successfully generate these explanations. Not just that, but maybe take a step further and come up with some exercises, like 10 fill-in blank sentences that make you really, apply these concepts. So that would be one thing. Another thing that is maybe a little bit less intuitive, it has to do with how we think about text. So of course, generative models are text-based, no question about that. But when we are thinking about language, we are thinking about an embodied experience. We are thinking about text, not just in terms of strings, but also in terms of cultural artifacts, movies, music, clothing, things like that. One of the things that these technologies can do is provide you with examples of specific I don't know, specific concepts and how they are implemented in, let's say, movies or songs. You can ask whether your model, whether it's Bard or ChatGPT, to give you a list of like top 5 songs that utilize past preterite, or it doesn't have to be that, anything really, or
Or you
maybe
could
movies.
say,
Mhm.
yeah, like say, give me three Nigerian movies about baseball.
There you go. With all the terminology. Um, it will provide the list if such movies exist. And then, in the same browser, you open up another tab, you go on YouTube or Vimeo, or just Google it, and see what you can find. And oftentimes that takes you to more hands down, more authentic applications of the language, and where these concepts that you're learning about are real, they're embodied, and they exist in the context, in the culturally relevant context. So that would be another way in which generative AI can be successfully used. Um,
So let's recap those two before we add more. So the first one is for explanations, like grammar explanations or lexical explanations. And to add to that, under the explanation rubric, you could also have it quiz you or give you like a test, and so you can interact with it and you could check your understanding. And then
mm,
the other thing that you mentioned is getting suggestions for things that you don't know about, sort of the proverbial unknown unknowns, like, oh, is there, I'm learning about baseball. Is there a Nigerian movie about baseball? Or
mhm.
I'm learning the past. Is there a good French movie that talks about the past? I'm sure there's like every French movie talks about the past. Um, So that's two things. That's two things. Um, so another one that I was thinking about. So to add to the list, let's see if we can get five maybe. So number three would be if you you might call it noticing. So like you're starting to notice something in the language, and noticing is part of the process of learning a language. You're noticing
Mhm,
something going on in the language, but you don't know what it's called. Or you can't do like a Google search because you don't have the language to precisely ask. You could say, I'm noticing this happening in the language. What's going on
mhm.
here? And ChatGPT can analyze that. So it's kind of uh, it helps you crystallize things that you notice into the actual term for a thing.
Absolutely, and then, I mean, you can do a lot of interesting things with it. So, let's say that, just, sort of going with the, with the past tense, notion, um you can, let's say, have this you can have this technology, assume a role of a certain historical character in the culture of the target language that you are working on, you're trying to learn, and have the platform simulate that character in a way that you can have a conversation with them, right? Of course, it is important to keep in mind that it is not going to be a conversation the way that we conceive of a conversation, because robots, it turns out, are not very conversant. They are good at responding to us, but they're not very good at asking us questions and following up with their own thinking, because there is no thinking. So, but once we sort of internalize that and we are aware of it, I think it could provide, another realm of interesting practice.
Yeah, I think that I think that's true, and I would say one maybe, and this will be our fifth thing. You what you just said kind of alluded to cultural knowledge.
Mhm.
Um, so if you wanted, you could ask if you're sort of in the realm of culture as you're studying a language. You want to know like what are the most important uh, poems for for students of Sanskrit, or what are the
Mhm.
most important historical figures from 1550 to 1600 in Italy. That cultural knowledge is recorded and represented in um, in in the English, probably in the English corpus, but it will still lead you somewhere. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? So it can help you delve into the um,
Mhm.
help you delve into the culture, even if it cannot necessarily give you that culture in the target language.
Right.
Nonetheless, you can follow up and discuss the culture in the target language, following the lead that ChatGPT gave you. So it's great for exploration of culture, is what I'm saying.
Hmm. And yeah, that could be done textually. That could be done. That could really be done multimodally, because the references to other cultural artifacts are also fundamentally encoded in text, right? And they could be retrieved and presented. So absolutely.
So would you agree then? I mean, just to kind of conclude that what these tools do for us now and for the foreseeable future, or at least the near future, is they're more like helpers. They can help
Mhm.
us in some ways, but not in every way. And knowing how to distinguish what can ChatGPT do for me as I'm learning a language and where will it lead me astray, that's probably a really important area of discernment.
To me, that is a very exciting area of discernment, and I would encourage students as well as instructors really to play around with these tools, with these technologies, for lack of a better word, and see what works, and see what doesn't work, and maybe, more interestingly, how can we fix the things that don't work, or conversely break the things that work, and why, right?
There we go. Let's leave it there. Simon,
Okay,
thank you so much for speaking with me again. I really appreciated this conversation.
of course, always a pleasure, Chris. Thank you.